I want to optimize the chance of people to make it to 110 healthy. Right? That's it. So to make it to 110 healthy, you have to solve it all. Right? And it's a very ambitious plan. And of course, if you get cancer or you get diabetes or you get Alzheimer, that's not going to happen. So then the focus, of course, is on healthy longevity for the sake of reaching that goal.
From the University of Southern California, Leonard Davis School of Gerontology, this is Lessons in Lifespan Health, a podcast about the science and scientists improving how we live and age. I'm Sean Curran, Associate Dean of Research.
And I'm Orly Bellman, Chief Communications Officer. On today's episode, how a mentor's extreme experiments with caloric restriction prompted Valter Longo to focus on fasting mimicking diets as a way to help prevent disease, promote healthy aging, and prolong our ability to stay young. When it comes to what, when, and how we eat, fasting, voluntarily abstaining from food for varying periods of time, is having a moment. It was the most popular diet of 2018, according to a survey from the International Food Information Council Foundation. Forms of fasting rank among Google's top trending diet searches, and seemingly ageless celebrities like Halle Berry and Hugh Jackman praise the practice for helping them to look, feel, and even sleep better.
In scientific circles, no less than Hippocrates is said to have prescribed it to spur healing. USC Leonard Davis School professor Valter Longo has been at the forefront of the modern fasting movement for more than 20 years. Time magazine calls him the fasting evangelist and one of the 50 most influential people in healthcare. Today, we learn more about his research and the reasons he is leading the charge for making manageable changes in how we eat.
The reality is 90% of people are never going to change what they eat. Neither the quantities nor the type. They may make small changes, but they're not going to make big changes in the long run. They could make big changes for 6 months, for 12 months, and then they go back. That's a reality, right? We have 1 million studies showing that. So then people should start dealing with that reality and say, okay, let's come up with something that doesn't require people to change their habits, but it does require maybe once in a while to do certain things, or maybe small changes. For example, a few years ago, we published on proteins, right? How detrimental protein intake, animal protein intake alone is, right? So now if you went to somebody and say, you could do everything you did before, but I just ask you one thing, reduce your protein intake by 40%. Now it starts to become reasonable. I say, I can eat everything else I always eat? Yes. I can even eat red meat. If that's what you got to do, yes. But can you decrease it by 40%? Just the protein sources, right? So that's the kind of interventions and recommendation that I think that we need to start focusing on.
Longo's Longevity Diet, which is also the name of his best-selling book, advocates for a mostly plant-based, low-protein Mediterranean-type diet that incorporates several multi-day stretches of a fasting mimicking diet that contains calorie intake low enough to trick the body into getting the benefits of fasting without the downsides. In fact, Longo wants you to eat more of the right foods.
I think the fasting mimicking diet should be done on average maybe 3 times a year. That's it. And it's not fasting. It's 900 calories a day on average, right? So 3 times a year, 900 calories a day is nothing, right? It's really, and anyways, so the everyday diet needs to be mostly vegan, fish a couple times a week, high nourishment, eat more. And by eating more, I mean, for example, a classic dish in my book is 50 grams of pasta, let's say 2 ounces of pasta, and then 350 grams of chickpeas and another 100 grams of mixed vegetable. Right? It's a big dish, and it's a big dish full of fibers, full of nourishment, and if it's organic, it's also going to be a really, really healthy dish with everything in it, including the proteins, but also it's a dish that fills your stomach. It doesn't overfill it, but fills it to a point where you feel both at the nourishment level and at the mechanical level. It's just really pushing on the walls of the stomach, and it's telling your brain, stop.
This is the type of dish Longo says he often ate as a child in Italy. Valter moved to the US as a teen and planned on a career in music, but he got into science instead, eventually joining the lab of Roy Walford at UCLA, one of the leading experts in calorie restriction and aging.
Yeah, so Walford was, back then he was a little bit of a superstar because he locked himself up in a place called Biosphere 2 in the middle of the Arizona desert and started the first human study on calorie restriction, which is really following up on the studies that he did and a few others did on mice. And the study was very simple in mice or human. You take a normal diet, not a diet, not an excessive diet, but a regular diet, and a regular weight animal, and you cut the calories by 30% or so. And then we knew that at least in some mice, this caused a major lifespan extension, but also made the mice much healthier. So he did the first human study that was about 30% calorie restriction, and him and another 7 people went inside of this sealed environment in Arizona near Tucson, and they stayed there for 2 years, believe it or not.
Wolford and his team showed results similar to the mice. They had reductions in body weight, blood pressure, cholesterol, and blood glucose. But the experiment took a toll.
And so Walford was the medical doctor inside of this Biosphere project. And so they eventually published the results, which are really remarkable results on the effects of this 30% calorie restriction on humans, matching those in mice, but also revealing that this was probably not going to work, meaning that it was very obvious that they were almost, they looked anorexic, and they were very upset, and you could tell that this was not something that anybody else could really do, or very, very few people could do.
In addition, subsequent studies on primates found that severe caloric restriction provided very little in the way of extending lifespan.
And so those experiments, together with the monkey studies and the same calorie restriction, I think told us that there is no doubt that there is the secret to many diseases in those calorie restriction studies, but calorie restriction is not the answer.
In his own research, Longo wanted to take a closer look at what happened to organisms when they were deprived of all nutrients.
And I, early on with the studies in E. coli and yeast, I saw calorie restriction as coming from starvation. Meaning the effects that we were seeing in calorie restriction, that even the Walford was seeing, is probably coming from the mechanisms developed by organisms that were when they were completely starving.
Longo turned to biochemistry and started to study starvation in yeast.
One of the first studies that I did in yeast was switching to water, and in fact saw again that they were living much longer, and they were also much more resistant to stress. So let's say heat or oxidative stress. So so almost immediately I started working on fasting, starvation in yeast, and then on the mechanisms that were responsible for making the starving yeast so long-lived. So eventually, if you jump ahead, I came up with the idea, well, what if you just starve a mouse, in this case, for a few days, and then you bring it back to the normal diet, and you do this once or twice a month, what happens? And so we started from that, observing that the mice became, like the yeast, became very resistant, and they looked healthier, et cetera, et cetera. So if you starve them, they become really protected. So I started thinking, what would this be useful for? And the first idea was chemotherapy.
In a 2008 study, Longo found that fasting for 2 days protected healthy cells against the toxicity of chemotherapy, while the cancer cells stayed sensitive. These results opened the door to a new way of thinking about cancer treatments, one that shields healthy cells to allow for a more powerful assault on cancerous ones. They also led to the creation of the first fasting mimicking diet, which Longo developed as a way to put patients with cancer in a fasting state while still allowing them to eat.
The oncologists did not want to fast the patients, and the patients did not want to fast. So then we basically went to the National Cancer Institute and said it'd be nice if that was considered by them, and they came up with a call on fasting mimicking diets, essentially, and say, well, can you develop, you or anybody that wants to understand the connection between food ingredients so well and genes, can you develop something that people can eat, but to the body, whether it's a mouse or a person, it's gonna mean fasting, water-only fasting, meaning that it will cause very similar changes if somebody was not eating at all. So that's what a fasting mimicking diet is.
In the past decade, brief cycles of periodic fasting mimicking diets have clinically demonstrated a range of beneficial effects on aging and risk factors for cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and other age-related diseases in mice and humans. More recent studies have also shown promise for treating multiple sclerosis and Crohn's disease.
I want to optimize the chance of people to make it to 110 healthy. Right? That's it. So to make it to 110 healthy, you have to solve it all. Right? And it's a very ambitious plan. And of course, if you get cancer or you get diabetes or you get Alzheimer, that's not going to happen. So then the focus, of course, is on healthy longevity for the sake of reaching that goal.
Based on his USC research, Longo founded L-Nutra, a nutri-technology company that offers packaged versions of the FMD. Longo says the company is gathering clinical data related to efficacy and side effects, and they hope to one day gain FDA approval to use the diet as a tool to treat disease. Longo has an ownership interest in L-Nutra and says he will donate 100% of his shares in the company to research and charity. Longo's USC lab is currently delving further into how the FMD dietary intervention affects regeneration and disease resistance.
Well, first of all, we published recently a paper looking at diabetes mouse model, both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So type 1 is the one where insulin is not produced by the pancreas because of autoimmunities usually. And type 2 is where the patient gets progressively more insulin resistant, so insulin doesn't work, so the pancreas struggle, and eventually there is insulin dependency, so the patient becomes dependent on injection of insulin. And in mice, it worked incredibly well. I mean, almost like too good to be true. And we showed that the remarkable part is that it clearly reversed insulin resistance. So the insulin now was working very well. The insulin that was no longer working was working very well. But the big thing was the pancreas being regenerated. So basically the cycles of fasting mimicking diet and refeeding turned this what looks like an embryonic-like program. What I mean by that is that if you look at the genes that were turned on, there were lots of the genes that are normally only turned on when the embryo is first formed, right? So when the organ is being generated, we're thinking that this is really going back, and it makes sense to activating the same programs that are activated to make the organ in the first place, to regenerate and fix the organ.
He is planning a clinical trial to test this in humans and has coined the term Gerontology to explore the question of how to stay young and not just stay healthy.
So this really can be used for almost anything, and again, it's not about one system, one cell, one thing. It's really about why is it that most 18-year-olds are in perfect health, and they've been around for 18 years, right? So they're fairly old, even at 18, but nothing ever happens to them, right? But how is it that a mouse that is 18 months old is fairly healthy, but by 2 years of age or 2.5 years of age is almost guaranteed to be sick? So it's really a program that is set, and each organism's got a different program, and that's really the focus. How do you took that program, not just the longevity program. Now I talk about also Gerontology, right? So the youth program. Well, what's a youth program? And so why? Because, if you look at humans, there is a health span. So for what period you remain healthy, right? You could be healthy 100 years of age, but barely walking. But for what period you remain young? And that may be 45, 50, you can claim, right? So that's really what this fasting movement is about. How do you change that system? How you trick and reset things so that you're going back, maybe not to 18, but certainly to that state where everything was in place. And how do you do that?
Longo uses a car analogy to explain.
How do I get a car to last for 110,000 miles, right? You could really try to protect the tires, right? And use chemicals to protect them. And somebody comes around and say, well, how are you doing that? Why don't you just take it and replace the tires every 5 years, right? So that is the idea that we're trying to implement. This is not really about the tires and how they get worn out, so the aging of the tire. Who cares, right? Like, who cares about you? Care about the aging of your tires? No. And why is that? Because you can replace them. Now, if you weren't able to replace them, you'd be very worried about your tires, right? And so that's the thing. How many things can be replaced in a human body? And if you did that, would the car ever break down? And would the human body ever break down?
Longo himself hopes to live to 120. He thinks that following a fasting mimicking diet can help with this replacing process, even if it's done an average of only 3 times a year.
So the idea is just to go around the body and get rid of a lot of damaged components and replace them with functional ones. So it should really work with many, many, many different things. But I think it's about mechanisms. Yeah, I think it's got little to do with food, at least the fasting component. It's got a little to do with food in general, with eating, but it's got more to do with, again, the ability of a system to reset.
He is also trying to reset or restart how we talk about food and fasting.
Yeah, so I always say that fasting doesn't really mean anything. Fasting is like saying eating. And as we all know now, if you say, oh, is eating good for you? Well, yes and no, right? So it can be very good or very bad. It depends what you eat. And fasting is the same way. It can be very good or very bad, depending what you do, how long you do it for, who you are, etc., etc. So then we've been trying, and I've been one of the few ones that have been trying to move away from words that dominating like intermittent fasting, and really start saying, pay attention, be careful, because fasting-based intervention can be very powerful or very damaging.
Longo recently organized the first international conference on fasting, dietary restriction, longevity, and disease. Top researchers from Harvard, MIT, the Salk Institute, and other institutions gather at USC for a 2-day conference that offered education for doctors and the lay public, and also provided an opportunity to start to set standards, and also reality checks for the increasingly popular and often improvised practice.
Conferences like that are really important to make sure that we keep getting it right. Not only that, we started on the right foot, but that we continue to have universities being involved and people coming up with the positive and the negative. And I think that to challenge it, you really need to have lots of universities, lots of leaders, and lots of clinical trials and lots of basic research. And so I think that's for the first time that this is happening.
Indeed, several large clinical trials are now underway. A National Institute on Aging study is testing an intermittent fasting diet in obese people aged 55 to 70 with insulin resistance. The NIA states that researchers will continue to explore many unresolved questions around determining the long-term benefits and risks of various eating patterns, including looking at which diets are feasible as a long-term practice, what specific biological effects on aging and disease are triggered by a particular eating pattern, what ways of eating are best for different age groups, and whether an eating pattern that's found to help one person might not have the same effect on another. As these findings come in, Longo reminds us that the challenge is to translate what works in labs and clinics into real results that people can maintain in their daily lives.
There is nothing that even comes close to the benefit that we will have for almost nothing, right? Free or close to free by changing food habits. And it could be revolutionary.
That wraps up this lesson in Lifespan Health. We'd like to thank Professor Valter Longo for his time and expertise, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to listen in. Join us again for another lesson in Lifespan Health, and please subscribe to our podcast and learn more about us at lifespanhealth.usc.edu.
A disclaimer: L-Nutra products are used in studies of the fasting mimicking diet. Both Longo and USC have ownership interests in L-Nutra, which have been disclosed and managed under USC's institutional conflict of interest policies. USC offers no guarantee about L-Nutra, its effectiveness, its potential for FDA approval, or any other representation or warranty, express or implied by the statements made in this podcast. USC is not responsible and in no event shall be liable for any damages that may arise from your reliance on the statements made in this podcast.